The afternoon sun was burning the color of hammered copper over Redemption Creek when Marshal Harlan Stone looked into the eyes of three children who had just learned their mother was never coming home, and he felt something fracture inside his chest that he was certain would never be repaired. He had delivered death notifications before. 14 years as a lawman had forced that particular cruelty upon him more times than he could count. He had stood on dirt porches and wooden stoops and canvas tent flaps and told wives their husbands were gone, told fathers their sons were buried in unmarked graves, told mothers things that caused them to crumple like paper in rain. He had learned to hold his hat in both hands, to look directly at the bereaved, to speak plainly without softening the blow so much that the meaning got lost in kindness. But he had never stood before three children and watched their world collapse into rubble, and he had never had to do it knowing with absolute certainty that the woman who was gone had been worth every good word that had ever been said about her. Rose Sawyer was 12 years old and trying very hard not to cry. His jaw was set in that way boys learn to set their jaw when they were too young to have been forced into needing such armor. Beside him, Rose Sawyer was 9, and she had gone completely still in the way that prey animals went still when they understood that the predator was already too close. The youngest, Thomas, was only 6, and he simply stared at Harlan with enormous dark eyes that held a question the child could not yet articulate. Harlan crouched down on one knee in the dust of the porch so that he was at eye level with Thomas. "Your mother kept every promise she ever made," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended, sandpaper pulled across raw wood. "In 14 years of carrying this badge, I have never seen that before. Not once. Not from anyone." Elias broke then, a single sound escaping him that he immediately swallowed, and the swallowing of it was somehow worse than if he had wept openly. And Harlan Stone, who had not cried since the age of 19 when he had buried his own father on a frozen Kansas prairie, felt the dangerous pressure of grief behind his eyes and understood that Rose Sawyer had done something extraordinary. Not just to her children, to him. She had done it to him, too. He had known her for exactly 8 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. He had counted, not because he was the sort of man who counted such things, but because the day Rose Sawyer arrived in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, was the kind of day that carved itself into memory whether a man wanted it to or not. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of red rock, the kind of landscape that looked punishing from a distance and revealed a harsh beauty only when you had committed to living inside it. The town had grown up around a water source and a silver claim, and by 1882 it had accumulated a population of roughly 400 souls, a saloon that stayed busy 6 days a week and scandalously busy on the 7th, a general store run by a man named Percy Hollies who was honest about prices and dishonest about weight, a church with a leaking roof, and a preacher who compensated for the building's inadequacy with the volume of his sermons, and a marshal's office where Harlan Stone had kept order for the past 3 years. Harlan was 34 years old when Rose arrived. He was not a man people described as handsome, exactly, though women had found him interesting in the way that weathered and purposeful things could be interesting. He was tall and lean with the kind of economy of movement that came from years of being careful. His eyes were the gray-green color of sage after rain, and they missed very little. He had a scar along his jaw from a knife fight in Abilene in 1874 that he rarely discussed, and a reputation for absolute fairness that he protected with something close to religious devotion. He was eating his breakfast at the table outside Delphine Marceau's establishment, which was both the best place for food in Redemption Creek and the only place, when the stage from Santa Fe arrived with Rose Sawyer and her 3 children. He noticed her because she was the sort of woman who organized a descent from a stagecoach, the way a general organized a campaign. She handed Nora down first, then turned back and lifted Thomas, then waited while Elias scrambled out under his own power with the dignity of a boy determined to prove he needed no assistance. Then she stepped down herself, smoothed her dark skirt with both hands, looked up at the red rock ridges as if taking their measure, and turned to instruct the driver about which of the trunks were fragile. She was not a small woman, but she carried herself in a way that made her seem capable of taking up exactly as much or as little space as a situation required. Her hair was the dark brown of river mud after flooding, thick and pinned up efficiently rather than decoratively. Her face was the kind that improved with attention, features arranged in a combination that suggested intelligence and patience in roughly equal measure. She was, Harlan estimated, around 30 years old, though she might have been older. Difficulty had a way of adding years that could mislead a casual observer. He had gone back to his eggs and tried not to stare, because he was not a man who stared, and he had told himself that whatever story was attached to a widow arriving in Redemption Creek with 3 children and a collection of trunks was none of his particular business. This was the first of several positions he took that Rose Sawyer would systematically dismantle over the following months. She had come to Redemption Creek because she had accepted a position as schoolteacher, replacing the previous incumbent, a Mr. Gerald Fitch, who had departed abruptly when certain financial irregularities connected to the school funds were discovered. The town council had been conducting correspondence with Rose for 4 months, during which she had supplied references from 2 previous schools in Missouri where she had taught, a letter from her deceased husband's minister attesting to her character, and a very precise list of conditions under which she would accept the position, including a salary adjustment of 15% above what Fitch had been paid, a schoolhouse that did not leak during monsoon season, and a cottage for her family that was within reasonable walking distance of the school. The council had agreed to all of it, mostly because no one else had applied. Harlan learned all of this from Delphine, who learned everything that occurred in Redemption Creek within approximately 48 hours of its occurrence, and shared the information with a generosity that had both social and practical value. Delphine was 61 years old, originally from New Orleans, and had been feeding Harlan breakfast for 3 years with the affectionate authority of a woman who viewed her regular customers as a form of extended family. She negotiated, Delphine said approvingly, setting down a second cup of coffee in front of Harlan the morning after Rose Sawyer arrived. The council told Teller she drove a hard bargain, and Teller said it like it was a flaw. I told him any woman raising 3 children alone out here who does not drive a hard bargain deserves what she gets. She teach before? Harlan asked, the question idle, professional in his own mind. New arrivals were his professional responsibility. Missouri, 7 years. Husband died of the fever 2 years ago, left her with the children and debts, and she cleared the debts and found this position and made the journey with those 3 little ones. Delphine made a sound of deep appreciation. That is a particular kind of strong, Harlan, the kind that does not announce itself. He had filed this information away and intended to leave it there. But Redemption Creek was a town of 400 people in a valley between red rocks, and leaving things in their filed places was more an aspiration than a reliable practice. He met her formally 6 days after her arrival, when Thomas Sawyer, age 6, managed to lock himself inside the storeroom of Percy Hollis's general store while Rose was purchasing supplies. Percy, who was an anxious man by temperament, and the presence of a weeping child trapped in his storeroom, pushed him toward the edge of something unmanageable, sent his boy to fetch the marshal, because that was what you did when situations exceeded your personal capacity, regardless of whether a situation technically required law enforcement. Harlan arrived to find Rose already crouching at the storeroom door, her voice steady and calm as she talked to Thomas through the wood, while Percy wrung his hands behind her and Elias and Nora stood at precise distances that suggested a family accustomed to distributing its attention across multiple simultaneous crises. "Thomas," Rose was saying, "do you remember what I told you about locks?" A muffled, tearful sound from the other side. "I know you are frightened. I know the dark is not pleasant, but you are safe. Nothing in that room will hurt you, and I will get you out. Do you remember what I said about promises?" Another sound, slightly less tearful. "I said I would always come for you, and I am here." Harlan had his pick from his belt and had the storeroom door open in about 45 seconds. Thomas came out tear-streaked and launched himself at Rose with the full-body commitment of a 6-year-old, and she held him and said, simply, "There. You see." "I came," and then stood up with the boy balanced on her hip and looked at Harlan with brown eyes that were absolutely composed. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. "I hope we have not inconvenienced you significantly." "Not significantly," he said. She smiled, brief and genuine, and there was something in it that went past his professional reserve and landed somewhere he had not expected. He had put it aside. He was practiced at putting things aside. The first time they had a real conversation, meaning one that went past the functional exchange of information required by their respective positions, was 3 weeks after her arrival, in mid-May, when a dispute over water rights between two neighboring ranchers had escalated to the point of firearms being drawn, and Harlan had spent a brutal 2 days mediating a resolution that both parties hated approximately equally, which was the best outcome he could have reasonably hoped for. He had been sitting on the steps of the marshal's office at dusk, too tired to go home and too awake to sleep, when Rose Sawyer walked past with a purposeful stride that suggested she had somewhere to be. She stopped when she saw him. "You look as though you have been through something," she said. "Water rights dispute," he said. "2 families, 1 creek tributary, and 30 years of accumulated grievances. Resolved, after a fashion." She sat down on the step beside him without asking, which startled him slightly, and looked out at the main street of Redemption Creek, where the last of the evening light was doing something extravagant with the dust. "In my experience," she said, "resolved after a fashion is about the best most disputes ever get. People tend to hold on to the injury even after the practical matter is settled. You have seen a lot of disputes." "I have 3 children and I teach 32 others 5 days a week," she said. "Dispute management is roughly half the occupation." He had laughed. He had genuinely laughed, and it had felt unfamiliar in a way that was itself revealing, and she had looked at him with a sideways attention that suggested she found the sound interesting. They talked for an hour, about Missouri and about New Mexico. About the particular challenges of teaching children, whose families had come from a dozen different places, and held a dozen different sets of assumptions about what education was for. About the nature of law in a place where the law was still being assembled, where the legal frameworks from the established states did not always translate cleanly to the particular realities of the territory. She was the most genuinely direct person he had spoken to in years. She held opinions, and she stated them with a clarity that was not aggressive but simply honest. And when he disagreed with something she said, she engaged the disagreement rather than retreating from it or becoming defensive. He walked her home, because it was full dark by the time they realized how long they had been talking, and she thanked him at the door of the cottage with the same composed manner she applied to everything, and went inside, and he walked back to his office in the dark thinking about nothing in particular. Which was a lie he told himself. He was thinking about her. The hidden motive of his own interest was something he examined with the same methodical care he applied to evidence in a case. He was 34 years old, and he had been alone for a long time by choice, because he had observed that the profession of law enforcement in frontier territories was not compatible with the softer obligations of connection, and he had made a decision about which he valued more, and that decision had held for a decade. He had secrets, as all people carried secrets, but his particular secrets were mostly the ordinary ones of a man who had seen hard things and learned to set them down somewhere interior where they did not trouble the functional surfaces of his daily life. Rose Sawyer was a complication he had not invited. She was also, as June became July, and the desert heat pressed down on Redemption Creek with the authority of something absolute, increasingly the person he found himself wanting to talk to at the end of days that required the most from him. She came to the marshal's office one morning in late June, which was unusual enough that he was alert before she said anything. She had the children with her, the three of them arranged at her back with an orderliness that suggested she had given specific instructions. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I want to do it properly rather than let it reach you through the town's information network, which is efficient but not always accurate." He gestured her to sit. She sat. "My husband's brother," she said, "is a man named Curtis Vane. He is the reason we left Missouri, and I have received information through a contact in Santa Fe that he has learned where we are." She said it without any theatrical quality, just information, delivered cleanly. But there was something behind her eyes that she was managing with visible effort, and Harlan understood that the management of it cost her something. "Tell me about Curtis Vane," he said. She told him. It took approximately 30 minutes and covered significant territory, including the nature of her late husband Daniel Sawyer's debts, the extent to which those debts had been manipulated by Curtis into a mechanism for claiming authority over Rose and the children, 2 incidents in Missouri that had involved law enforcement, and from which Curtis had extracted himself through means that suggested either significant influence or significant luck, and the specific threat that had caused Rose to take the teaching position in New Mexico territory, rather than remain in a state where Curtis Vane knew every road and every judge and every favor that was owed. She was not asking for sympathy. She was providing information she judged to be relevant to his professional capacity and incidentally relevant to her own safety. "He will claim guardianship of the children," she said. "He has documentation that I believe is forged but which was prepared well enough to cause difficulty in a court. He has told people in Missouri that I am unstable, that I am not capable of managing the children's welfare or the estate." "What estate?" She gave a small, dry smile. "Exactly. There was no estate. Daniel left debts which I cleared. Curtis invented an estate for the purposes of his legal claim." "And the children?" Harlan asked. She looked at her children, who were sitting on the bench by the window with the studied composure of young people who had heard adult versions of their own situation discussed before, and had learned to receive it without flinching. Even Thomas, at 6, seemed to understand that his job in this moment was to sit still. "He has no interest in the children," Rose said, and now there was an edge in her voice like a blade someone had just drawn. "He wants to establish legal control because it gives him leverage. Over me, over anything I might possess or earn or become. He is the kind of man who cannot tolerate a woman who manages without his permission." Harlan looked at her steadily. "Are you asking for protection?" "I am informing you of a potential threat to the town's peace," she said. "If Curtis Vane arrives in Redemption Creek, he will not arrive quietly. He is not a subtle man. He will make claims and escalate and attempt to use the law as a weapon, and I want you to have the context before that happens so that you are not navigating his version of events without the full picture." It was one of the most professionally delivered personal disclosures he had ever received. "I'll look into his legal standing," Harlan said. "The territorial courts have specific provisions about jurisdictional claims. If his documentation is from Missouri courts, it has limited authority here." She exhaled, a very controlled thing, but he caught it. "Thank you, Rose." He used her name without planning to, and they both noticed it. "Thank you for telling me directly." She looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes. "I have found," she said, "that directness saves a great deal of time that most people do not have to spare." July in Redemption Creek was a kind of siege. The heat was implacable and total, and the town moved through it with the particular energy of people who had no choice but to continue. Rose taught school in a building that was technically cooler than the outdoors by virtue of having walls and was practically an oven by midday. Harlan had learned from Delphine, who had learned from the school board secretary, that Rose had written to the board requesting proper ventilation and had been promised consideration, which was the institutional equivalent of silence. He built her a window. More accurately, he hired Clem Duro, the town's carpenter, and the two of them spent a Saturday morning in early July cutting a proper window opening in the schoolhouse wall and fitting it with a frame and shutters that could be opened and closed to manage airflow. He had not asked permission because he had not thought to, and he had not told Rose in advance because it had seemed to him that a thing either needed doing or it did not, and this one needed doing. She arrived at the schoolhouse Monday morning and stopped in the doorway. He was finishing the last of the shutter fastening, because Clem had a bad shoulder and there had been a screw giving trouble, and he turned to find her looking at the window with an expression that moved through surprise and something more complicated and arrived at a controlled warmth that she appeared to be working to keep contained. "You built me a window," she said. "The children were going to roast." He put his tools away. "Harlan." She said his name deliberately, and the deliberateness was itself something. "Thank you. Don't mention it," he said, which was the phrase he used when things were more significant than he wanted to acknowledge. She looked at him with the sideways attention she occasionally applied to him, the look that made him feel catalogued in ways both comfortable and slightly dangerous. "I am going to mention it," she said, "because you did something decent and I intend to acknowledge it. My children will be less miserable this summer because of that window. That matters." He had no response that did not require crossing into territory he was being careful about, so he nodded and left, and he did not examine the warmth in his chest until he was 3 blocks away. The problem with what he was feeling was that it was inconvenient in approximately every direction. He was the marshal of a small town, and Rose Sawyer was a woman in a difficult situation who depended on the professional competence of the town's institutions. Getting personally attached to someone whose circumstances he was responsible for managing was the kind of thing that created compromised judgment and complicated decision-making and potentially dangerous situations where personal feeling and professional duty pulled in opposite directions. He was aware of all of this. He was also aware, with the resigned clarity of a man who had been honest with himself as a discipline for most of his adult life, that awareness of a problem was not the same as immunity to it. In August, Curtis Vane arrived. Harlan knew he was coming 2 days before he arrived because his contacts in Santa Fe sent him a wire with a physical description and a summary of the man's history, which included 2 charges in Missouri that had been dismissed, a reputation for litigious aggression that had tied up multiple parties in expensive legal proceedings, and a personality profile assembled from various depositions that described a man who used legal mechanisms the way a hunter used traps. Patient in the setting and ruthless in the spring, he told Rose the night before. She was sitting on the cottage porch when he came, the children inside and the evening cooling toward something almost pleasant, and she looked at his face and said, immediately, "He is coming." "Tomorrow or the day after," Harlan said. He sat down on the step because standing over someone while delivering information was a posture that implied a power differential he did not want. "I want to talk to you about what happens when he arrives." She folded her hands in her lap. He noticed she did not grip them. "He will go to the magistrate first," Harlan said. "He will present his documentation and request a hearing." The magistrate here is Horace Webb, who is not a bad man but who responds to formal legal paperwork with a deference that does not always account for the possibility that the paperwork is fraudulent. "So I need a lawyer. I have already sent a wire to Carson City. There is a lawyer named Pemberton who does territorial family law and whose name has been given to me by a judge I trust. He is coming, but he will not arrive for 4 days." She absorbed this. "So there will be a gap between when Curtis arrives and when Pemberton arrives." "Yes. During that gap, Curtis may attempt to use the hearing process to establish a provisional custody claim. I want you to understand what I can and cannot do within my authority as marshal." She looked at him directly. "Tell me." "I cannot prevent a legally scheduled hearing. I cannot instruct the magistrate to ignore documentation that has been formally presented, What I can do is ensure that any documentation Curtis brings is reviewed carefully, and that Webb understands the full picture. What I can also do," he paused, "is make sure that nothing happens to you or your children outside the courtroom." She was quiet for a moment. "You think he might try something outside the legal process? The history I have received suggests he does not limit himself to one strategy." Rose Sawyer looked out at the dark, at the ridge line of red rock that was a black shape against the stars. She was doing the thing she did when she was processing information that had significant personal weight, a particular quality of stillness that he had learned to recognize as thought rather than helplessness. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to tell me everything you have. Every document, every correspondence, any record you kept of any incident. If there is a dark past he is hiding, any detail that contradicts his account of himself or his relationship with your family, I need it." She nodded once, stood up, went inside, and he heard the sound of a trunk being opened, and she came back 12 minutes later with a flat leather folio that was thick with papers. "I have kept records since the day Daniel died," she said, handing it to him. "I had a feeling I would need them." He took the folio. It was heavier than he expected. He looked at it and then at her. "Rose," she waited, "you have been carrying this alone for 2 years." She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite acceptance, but contained elements of both. "I have been carrying it with my children," she said. "I am not alone." He held her gaze for longer than was strictly necessary, and then said good night and walked back to his office, and spent half the night reading through 2 years of carefully maintained records that revealed a woman who had been documenting her own survival with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had known from the beginning that survival would require evidence. Curtis Vane arrived on a Thursday morning on the stage from Albuquerque. Harlan was there to meet it. He stood outside the stage depot with his badge visible and his hands loose at his sides, which was the posture of a man who was not looking for trouble and was completely prepared for it. And he watched Curtis Vane step down from the stage and take in the reception. Curtis was a large man who wore good clothes and had the kind of face that suggested he had spent considerable effort arranging it to project both authority and reasonableness. He was probably 40, well-fed, with eyes that were doing a rapid calculation behind an expression of polished cordiality. He looked at Harlan's badge and his calculation adjusted itself. "Marshal," he said pleasantly. "Curtis Vane. I believe I may have some business in your town." "Mr. Vane," Harlan said, "I know who you are. I want to have a conversation with you before you conduct any business." The pleasantness in Curtis's face became slightly fixed. "I have legal rights, Marshal, including the right to appear before a magistrate." "You have that right," Harlan agreed. "Nobody is disputing it. I just want us to have a direct conversation first. Get a cup of coffee." It was not a question, and Curtis Vane was smart enough to hear that it was not a question, and they walked to Delphine's and sat at a table, and Harlan laid out the situation with the same plainness he would have applied to any other matter of potential conflict in his jurisdiction. "You have documentation claiming guardianship authority over Rose Sawyer's children," Harlan said. "You will be submitting that documentation to Magistrate Webb. I want you to know that I have spent considerable time reviewing the territorial statutes on jurisdictional family law, and I want you to be fully informed that any documentation that is found to be fraudulent or misrepresented will create legal consequences that extend significantly beyond this territory." Curtis's eyes had gone from calculating to careful. "My documentation is entirely legitimate." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Harlan said, "and neither does anyone else." The hearing was set for Friday. Harlan spent Thursday in a state of controlled urgency, a man operating under a deadline, confirming with Magistrate Webb that every document Curtis submitted would be given proper scrutiny, sending a second wire to the lawyer Pemberton to confirm his travel timeline, and having 3 separate conversations with Rose that were ostensibly about legal strategy and were also something else, a sustained mutual recognition of what was at stake. She was afraid. He knew it because he had learned to read her, and the fear was not visible in the obvious ways, but was present in the slight tightness around her eyes and the quality of care with which she chose every word. She was afraid, and she was refusing to let the fear make any decision for her, and watching her do this was one of the most remarkable things Harlan Stone had ever witnessed. Thursday evening, after the children were in bed, she came to the marshal's office. She stood in the doorway and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly." "I will," he said. "What is the realistic outcome if Pemberton does not arrive in time?" He held the honest answer in his mouth for a moment before releasing it. "Webb will likely grant a provisional hearing. Curtis's documentation is professionally prepared, and even if it is fraudulent documentation that looks legitimate creates a burden of proof that takes time. There may be a period of confusion about authority, during which he might claim the children. He would have to get past me." She looked at him. "That is not a legal answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She came inside then and sat down across from his desk, and they looked at each other in the lamp light, and there was something between them that had been building for months, and that the current circumstances had rendered impossible to pretend was absent. "Harlan," she said, "I need to say something that is probably not appropriate given the complexity of our situation." "Say it," he said, his voice very quiet. "I trust you more than I have trusted anyone since Daniel died, and I want you to know that because tomorrow is uncertain and I have learned not to leave important things unsaid." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame moved in a draft and the shadows shifted, and he said, "Rose, I need to say something back." She waited. "I have been trying to keep appropriate distance," he said, "because your situation puts you in a position where my help could be misconstrued as leverage, and I did not want to be the kind of man who uses difficulty as an opening. But I need you to know that my investment in tomorrow has gone well past professional responsibility. It has been personal for some time." She looked at him with those steady brown eyes and then said, very quietly, "I know." Something eased in him, a long-held tension releasing like a knot coming free. They did not do anything about it that night. It was not the moment, and they were both people who understood the difference between an acknowledgement and an action. But she left with color in her cheeks that had not been there before, and he sat in his office after she was gone feeling something unfamiliar and significant and carefully hopeful. The hearing was not the catastrophe it could have been, and it was not the clean resolution Harlan would have preferred. Pemberton did not arrive in time. Curtis Vane presented his documentation with the practiced smoothness of a man who had done it before, and Magistrate Webb, who was not a bad man but was a procedural one, granted a provisional hearing scheduled for the following week, and declined to dismiss Curtis's claims outright pending proper legal review. Curtis, emboldened by this partial success, went to find Rose. Harlan was 20 feet behind him. He watched Curtis approach the cottage, and he watched Rose open the door, and he watched the two of them on the porch, Curtis speaking with what appeared to be rehearsed reasonableness, and Rose listening with the composed expression she used when she was deciding how much of what she was feeling to allow visible. He stayed at his distance. Rose had asked him to let her handle the first conversation directly, and he had agreed, because she had the right to confront her own darkness on her own terms. When Curtis's voice shifted, losing its reasonableness and finding something harder beneath it, Harlan closed the distance. "Problem," he said, stepping up to the porch. Curtis turned with the calculated irritation of a man whose performance has been interrupted. "This is a family matter, Marshal. Anything happening in this town is my matter," Harlan said. "That is the nature of the position." Curtis looked at Rose with a meaningful expression that contained considerable threat coded into its pleasantness. "I will be back," he said, "with the full weight of legal process." He left. Rose watched him go with an expression that was unreadable from the outside, and that Harlan suspected cost her considerably to maintain. Then she turned to Harlan and said, "He knows I have the children in a school routine. He thinks that will make me easier to manage." Does he know what you have in that folio? He knows I keep records. He does not know how complete they are. She looked at Harlan with something approaching a fierce light in her eyes. He underestimated me for the entire length of my marriage. It was the most consistently useful thing about him. Pemberton arrived on Tuesday, 2 days before the hearing, and he was exactly what was needed. A small, precise man in his 50s with the kind of intelligence that expressed itself as thoroughness. He spent 6 hours with Rose going through the folio document by document, and he emerged from those 6 hours with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with something resembling awe. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, "has kept records that would do credit to a county clerk. I have everything I need not merely to defend her position, but to have Curtis Vane's documentation investigated for fraud in the original Missouri jurisdiction." Harlan felt something settle in him. The hearing was before Magistrate Webb on a Thursday afternoon in August, in the back room of the magistrate's office, which served as the nearest thing Redemption Creek had to a courtroom. Curtis sat on one side with a lawyer he had brought from Albuquerque. Rose sat on the other side with Pemberton. Harlan sat at the back, off to one side, in his professional capacity and his personal one simultaneously. Pemberton was methodical and devastating. He went through Curtis's documentation piece by piece, identifying the specific legal language that was either misrepresented or fabricated, cross-referencing it with the territorial statutes on jurisdictional authority and the actual provisions of the Missouri probate code that Curtis had claimed as the basis for his guardianship claim. He then presented Rose's folio. It took an hour and a half. By the end of it, Magistrate Webb had the expression of a man who has been given 2 very different maps of the same territory and has figured out which one is accurate. He dismissed Curtis Vane's claim entirely. He recommended that the Missouri documentation be referred to the territorial attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud. He noted formally in his written decision that Rose Sawyer's records demonstrated a standard of care for her children's welfare that was, in his specific language, exemplary and unimpeachable. Curtis Vane left Redemption Creek the next morning on the early stage. Rose watched the stage go from the door of the cottage, and when it had disappeared around the bend of the road, she turned and found Harlan standing in the street, and she walked to him and said, very simply, "It is over." "It is over," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped forward, and he opened his arms, and she came into them with the particular way someone comes to a place they have needed and have been patient about reaching. And he held her in the middle of the street in the morning light of Redemption Creek, and the warmth of it was something he thought he would remember for the rest of his life. They had, as September came in, and the ferocious heat began to relent into something more like mere intensity, the long, careful conversation that people have when they have been attracted to each other for months and have been responsible about it, and are now in a position to be less so. He told her about his history, his origins on a Kansas farm, his early years of law enforcement in Abilene and Wichita, where the frontier was being contested daily, and the law was a thing you had to establish fresh in each situation rather than rely on as an existing structure. He told her about the specific ways that work had shaped him and the specific things it had cost him, including relationships that had not survived the demands of what he was, the long absences and the perpetual proximity to danger, and the difficulty of being fully present to the ordinary business of a life when your professional attention was always partly somewhere else. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention she brought to things that mattered to her, which was complete and unhurried, and when he was done she said, "You think you are not suited to this. I think I have evidence for that position," he said. "You built me a window," she said. "You stayed awake for 2 days reading through my files. You stood in this street at 8 in the morning to meet a man you knew was dangerous so that the first thing he saw in this town was your badge." She looked at him with the direct attention that still had the capacity to make him feel slightly exposed. "Harlan, your evidence is incomplete." He had no adequate response to that, so he kissed her instead, which was the first time in which she met with the warmth and precision of a woman who had decided and was acting on the decision. And when they separated, they were both breathing slightly differently, and there was a quality of settled rightness to the moment that he associated with the feeling of a complicated case finally becoming clear. It was not uncomplicated after that. Nothing real was uncomplicated. There were the children, who were each a separate and distinct negotiation. Elias, 12, who was protective of his mother with a fierceness that had been forged in 2 years of watching her manage impossible circumstances, received the information of Harlan's developing significance to Rose with a wary evaluation that reminded Harlan of nothing so much as a good lawman assessing a new situation. He did not object. He watched. Nora, 9, was more direct in the way that 9-year-old girls with significant intelligence could be brutally direct. She asked Harlan, approximately 2 weeks into the period of his open and acknowledged interest in her mother, whether he had ever been married before. No, he said. Why not? The work made it difficult to commit to people properly, he said, because he had decided early that Rose Sawyer deserved honest answers and would see through any version that was less than that. She considered this. Are you going to commit to my mother properly? That is my intention. What does that mean specifically? He had to think about that for a genuine moment. It means I intend to be present, for whatever comes. To keep my word and to be honest when keeping my word is difficult and to not disappear when things are hard. Rose Sawyer looked at him with those evaluating dark eyes. My mother is very good at knowing when people are not telling the truth. I know, he said. She can usually tell before the person knows it themselves. That is a gift, he said, and meant it. Nora had regarded him for another moment and then said, "Okay then," and gone back to her book. Thomas was 6 and had fewer complicated conditions, his primary concern being whether Harlan would sometimes push him on the wooden swing that Harlan had installed in the tree outside the cottage because it had seemed like a thing that should exist, and whether the marshal's horse, a big gray named Sergeant, would ever let Thomas sit on him. Both of these were affirmative, and Thomas's allegiance was essentially secured on those terms. The courtship, for that is what it was, took place over the fall and early winter of 1882, and it was one of the finest periods of Harlan Stone's life, a fact he recognized clearly and without reservation at the time, which was unusual for him. He was typically a person who recognized the value of things in retrospect. With Rose, he found himself aware of it while it was happening, and this awareness itself felt like a form of grace. She was extraordinary in her ordinary life. She taught school with a rigor and warmth that transformed it, her students' test results improving measurably within the first term, the school board confounded by what they were seeing and attributing it to various factors that were all, ultimately, Rose Sawyer. She ran her household with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, maintaining the cottage, managing the children's education and health, keeping the finances she had been paid in clear ledger order. But she was also capable of extraordinary joy. She laughed in a way that was physical and complete. She had opinions about books that she expressed with passionate specificity. She liked to walk in the early morning before the rest of the town was awake, and sometimes Harlan would join her on these walks, and they would move through the red and gold of the New Mexico dawn talking about things large and small, and he would think that this was what he had been building toward without knowing it for 34 years. He asked her to marry him in November, on one of those morning walks, when the air was cold and clear, and the sky was the particular deep blue that comes before full sunrise. He had not prepared a speech. He had stopped walking and turned to her and said, "Rose, I want to marry you. I want to be your husband and I want to be present for your children and for whatever life we make together. I am asking you directly because you have taught me that directness is the right way to approach important things." She had stopped walking and turned to face him, and for a moment she had been very still in that way of hers, and then she had said, "Yes, absolutely and without reservation." He had kissed her in the cold morning air and she had laughed against his mouth, and they stood in the red and gold light, and he felt, for the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, something that was not managing or maintaining or enduring but simply, thoroughly, happiness. The wedding was in December of 1882, in the leaking-roofed church with the loud preacher, who turned out to be excellent at the ceremonial aspects of his profession, even if his sermons ran long. And the entire town came because, in a town of 400, there was no category of community event, and Delphine provided a feast that ran to 7 dishes and was still talked about years later. Elias stood up for Harlan, a distinction that had been proposed by Rose and agreed to by Elias with a careful solemnity. That was the clearest signal, yet, that the boy's evaluation had concluded in a positive direction. Nora was fierce and luminous in a dress Rose had made, and Thomas was almost overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything. Rose wore a dress of dark blue wool with her hair arranged with a care she did not normally apply to it, and when Harlan saw her at the back of the church, his chest did the thing it had been doing since May. Except on this occasion, there was no reason at all to contain or redirect it. They said their vows to each other with the preacher's voice rolling over them like weather, and Harlan held her hands and looked at her face, and meant every word with the absolute specific weight of a man who had chosen very carefully and was entirely certain. After the wedding, after the feast and the congratulations and the particular warmth of a community choosing to celebrate something, they came home to the cottage which was now his home too, and after the children were in bed, they sat in the front room in the lamplight, and Rose leaned against him with the relaxed weight of someone who is somewhere they intend to stay, and he held her, and the fire made small sounds, and outside the December cold pressed against the windows, and inside was warmth and sufficiency and peace. Life in Redemption Creek after the marriage was the life Harlan had not quite believed could be his. He was still the marshal, still the man who managed the disputes and the dangers and the ordinary difficult business of keeping a small frontier town oriented toward something like order. He still had long days and occasionally dangerous ones, still dealt with the various human appetites for conflict and advantage that were the permanent subtext of life in a territory that was actively being settled. These things did not change, but he came home. He came home to a house that had children in it, children who were his now in the way that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with daily presence. And he came home to Rose, and the combination of these things was something that replenished what the work depleted in a way that nothing had previously managed. Elias, in the months after the wedding, made a gradual but genuine accommodation of Harlan into his understanding of family. The boy was methodical about it, testing in small ways, observing the results, adjusting his position based on evidence, which was a way of operating that Harlan found entirely comprehensible and quietly admirable. By spring, he was asking Harlan for opinions on things, specific targeted questions that revealed how seriously he took the answers. There was an afternoon in March when Elias came to the marshal's office looking for Harlan, an event significant enough in itself, and sat across the desk and said, "I want to know how you decide what is right when two things that are both right are against each other." Harlan had put down his pen and given the question the full attention it deserved, because it was not the question of a 12-year-old playing at adult thinking. It was a genuine inquiry from someone who had been forced by his circumstances into moral seriousness at an early age. They had talked for 2 hours, the afternoon light moving through the office windows, and Harlan had told him everything honest he knew about the navigation of competing goods and the nature of judgment, and the particular difficulty of decisions made under conditions of imperfect information. And Elias had listened with his brow furrowed and asked follow-up questions that were sharp and real. When he left, he stopped in the doorway and said, "I'm glad you're here," with the toneless delivery of someone who means something completely and does not know how to dress it up. "So am I," Harlan said. In the summer of 1883, Rose told Harlan she was pregnant. She told him in the morning directly, the way she told him everything, and she watched his face for the response, and what she saw there was not fear or complication, but an uncomplicated light that she recognized as genuine, and that caused her to close the distance between them and hold him tightly. "Are you glad?" she asked, muffled against his shoulder. "I am more glad than I have words for," he said, "which should be noted as unusual for me." She laughed, and the vibration of it went through him warm and real. They told the children at supper. Thomas was instantly and overwhelmingly enthusiastic, declaring with authority that the baby would be a boy and would be named for his horse sergeant, both of which were positions he maintained for several weeks before gradually revising. Nora asked practical questions about sleeping arrangements and the timeline for various developmental stages, having clearly done some advance reading on the subject. Elias was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good," in a way that contained a great deal more than the word itself. The pregnancy was not easy in the way that pregnancies in 1883 New Mexico territory had no particular obligation to be, and Harlan found himself in territory he had not navigated before. The specific helplessness of watching someone he loved move through difficulty he could not resolve for her, could only be present beside. He was present. He was entirely, completely present, in a way that surprised him with its totality, the way the specific domestic details of care, the making sure she had what she needed, the management of the household during the weeks when the nausea was at its worst, the presence at 3 in the morning when the discomfort woke her, arranged themselves naturally around his will to provide them. Rose noticed this with the quality of attention she applied to things she found significant. She said to him one evening when she was 7 months along and had reached the stage of pregnancy that made sustained comfort something of an achievement, "You are very good at this." "At what?" "Being here. Being the kind of person who can be depended on when it is inconvenient and difficult and unglamorous." He looked at her with the particular feeling she always called up in him. "Rose, where else would I be?" She took his hand and held it against the curve of her pregnancy, and they sat in the lamplight and outside Redemption Creek, conducted its ordinary complicated life. And inside there was the warmth that he understood now was not a thing that had existed in his life before, and that he would conduct any available negotiation to keep. Their son was born in February of 1884, at 2 in the morning in the back bedroom of the cottage, delivered by the town's doctor with Harlan present throughout, in a way that doctors of the period frequently discouraged, and that Rose insisted on, and that Harlan found he would not have traded for anything. They named him James, after Harlan's father, and Harlan held him in the first minutes of his life, with the specific stunned reverence of a man confronted with something entirely outside the parameters of his previous experience. Thomas, whose candidate for the baby's name had eventually migrated from sergeant to marshal, and finally to something more manageable, was deeply invested in James from the beginning, appointing himself with great seriousness to a protective function that mostly manifested as sitting very close to wherever James was placed, and providing a running commentary on James's expressions and sounds. Nora observed James with the combined scientific and maternal interest of a 9-year-old, who had read extensively on infant development and had opinions. She taught him things earlier than anyone expected because she started early, narrating the world to him in her clear, precise voice, and he watched her with the particular focused attention of a baby who has found someone interesting. Elias was 14 now, and with James he was something Harlan had not quite anticipated, gentle in a way that the boy had hidden under his necessary armor, sitting with the infant in the evenings, and talking to him in a low voice about things Harlan could not quite hear. And Harlan did not try to hear them because they were between Elias and his brother and they were private. The years settled into themselves with the quality of good years, defined more by accumulation than by dramatic event. Harlan remained the marshal of Redemption Creek through the changes that the decade brought to the territory, the continued influx of settlement, the shifting tensions between ranching and farming interests, the complex and often unjust negotiations over land that affected both settlers and the indigenous communities, whose prior claim to the land was honored in words and violated in practice with a consistency that Harlan confronted where he could within his legal authority, and wrote about in his reports to the territorial administration with a directness that occasionally made those administrators uncomfortable. He argued for the rights of the Apache families who passed through the territory, for the recognition of agreements that had been made and broken, for a legal approach to land that acknowledged the actual history of occupation, rather than pretending the territory had been empty before settlement arrived. He did not always win these arguments. He won some of them, and the ones he won mattered to specific people in specific ways that were real even when they were small. Rose, who had strong views on the injustice of dispossession, and had been teaching her students a version of territorial history that was more complete than the simplified account favored by the school board, supported his advocacy with the same directness she brought to everything, writing letters and attending meetings, and being the person in a room who said the thing that was true but uncomfortable when the thing needed saying. They were well suited. They were, in the specific way that people who have found their matching, complementary in the places where they were different and aligned in what mattered most. In 1886, a second child, a daughter this time, arrived. They named her Clara, and she was from the beginning a child of strong opinions who announced them at volume, and who had her mother's brown eyes and her father's quality of stillness when something was actually important, a combination that made her, as she grew, a deeply interesting person. James, 3 years older, regarded his sister with a mixture of bewilderment and devoted loyalty that evolved as they both grew into something that looked a great deal like what he had learned from watching Elias regard his own siblings. The family expanded to fill the cottage, and then the cottage was expanded. Harlan and Clem Duro adding 2 rooms over the summer of 1886 in a project that Thomas, now 10, participated in with an enthusiasm that was occasionally more effort than help and was entirely worth it. Elias, by 1887, was 17 and talking about the law. He had been reading Harlan's legal references for 2 years, asking specific and increasingly sophisticated questions about the territorial statutes, sitting in on hearings when they were appropriate for observation, absorbing the work from every angle he could access. "You want to be a lawyer," Harlan said one evening. Elias, who was still the boy who held his emotions at a careful distance before allowing them expression, said, "I think so. There are things you would need, education that is not available here. I know," a pause. "I have been thinking about the college in Santa Fe. They have a law preparatory program." Harlan looked at him steadily. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "About a year." "Have you talked to your mother?" "Not yet." Another pause, and then, in the deliberate way Elias had of saying important things, "I wanted to know what you thought first." This was not a small thing, and they both knew it. Harlan took the trust in it seriously. "I think," Harlan said, "that you have the mind for it and the character for it. I think the preparation work you would need to do is achievable. I think Santa Fe is far enough that it will be an adjustment for you and for everyone here, and I think you are capable of managing that adjustment." He paused. "And I think you should talk to your mother." Rose, when Elias brought it to her, was the response he had needed and trusted that she would be. She asked questions, practical and specific, covering funding and timeline and housing and the curriculum, and what Elias saw himself doing with the qualification when he had it. And then she said, "I think you should go." Elias looked at her with the expression he used when he was very moved and was working hard to keep it from his face. "You are sure?" "Elias." She took his face in her hands briefly, in the way she had done when he was 12 and crying in the dust of a terrible day. I did not raise you to stay small because leaving was frightening for me. I raised you to become what you are capable of becoming. Those are different things." He left for Santa Fe in the autumn of 1887, and the cottage was different in his absence, quieter in some specific way that had nothing to do with volume. And Rose and Harlan talked about him in the evenings, with the combination of pride and the ordinary ache of someone who has launched correctly into the world and is no longer in the room. He wrote letters. Regular, detailed letters that were in some ways more revealing than his in-person communication had been, as if distance gave him access to expressiveness that proximity had inhibited. He wrote about his studies and his debates with fellow students and his professors and the city and its scale relative to Redemption Creek, and occasionally he wrote things that were simply personal, about what he thought and felt and was figuring out, and these letters Rose saved and read again. The years turned. The territory changed. By 1890, New Mexico was closing in on statehood through a process that was, like everything in the territory's political life, complicated and contested and slower than most people wanted. The town of Redemption Creek had grown to nearly 1,000 people and had acquired a proper courthouse and a second school and a bank and a railroad depot that connected it more firmly to the larger structures of commerce and law. Harlan Stone was 42 years old in 1890 and had been the marshal of Redemption Creek for 11 years. He was, by this point, a figure of such established trust and authority in the community that the position had become something close to permanent in the public imagination, not because no one could challenge him, but because there was effectively no public appetite for doing so. He was fair and he was present and he kept his word, and in a frontier community, those were the three things that mattered most. He and Rose had a third child together in 1891, another boy they named Daniel, at Rose's request, for her first husband and the children's father, and Harlan agreed to this without hesitation, because it was the right thing to do and because his security in what he was to Rose and to the family was complete enough to hold the acknowledgement of Daniel Sawyer's prior place without diminishment. James, 7, was delighted by Daniel in the specific way of children who have younger siblings they feel proprietary about. Clara, 5, was skeptical at first and then deeply invested when she discovered that a baby was a thing you could instruct, and began doing so immediately. The household was large and loud and full, and Harlan sat at the head of a table that held 5 children of varying ages, including Nora, 15, who was being educated with fierce seriousness toward the possibility of becoming the first person in the Sawyer Stone family to attend a proper university. And he looked at all of them, and at Rose, who was passing biscuits and adjudicating a dispute between Thomas, now 15, and James about something entirely peripheral to anything of consequence. And he thought this was his life, this actual specific life that he inhabited every day. He was grateful for it in a way that had become as much a part of him as the badge and the gray sage eyes and the scar along his jaw. In 1893, Elias came home. He came home with a law degree from the New Mexico Territorial College preparatory program and a subsequent 2 years of reading law with a practice in Santa Fe. And he came home changed in the specific way that serious education changes serious people. His intelligence sharper and more organized, his way of speaking more precise, his understanding of the legal structures that shaped everyone's lives more complete and more critical. He also came home with a woman named Catherine Reyes, the daughter of a Santa Fe merchant family of Mexican heritage, whose family had been in New Mexico territory for 3 generations before the American annexation of 1848. And whose knowledge of the territorial land grant system and its contested history was both personal and profound. Rose received Catherine with the warmth and interest that Rose brought to all people she found significant, which was most people who came in contact with her, and Harlan shook Elias' hand, and then, after a moment, embraced him, and Elias returned the embrace with the fullness that his younger self had not been capable of. "You look well," Harlan said. "I am well," Elias said, and it was a statement of genuine account rather than social formula. The family dinner that evening had the quality of a particular kind of happiness, dense and specific, a table that held 3 generations of connection and care. Thomas and Nora on the verge of their own futures, and James and Clara and Daniel at various stages of becoming themselves, and Elias at the head of it in a way that was new, having arrived at a place of personal authority that did not require assertion. After the meal, after the children had dispersed to their various occupations and Catherine and Rose were talking in the front room with the quality of women who have discovered they have a great deal to say to each other, Elias and Harlan sat on the porch in the November evening. "She is remarkable," Harlan said, referring to Catherine. "Yes," Elias said simply, "she is." A comfortable silence. In the distance, the town went about its evening business. "Elias," Harlan said, "I want to say something." The younger man looked at him. "You were 12 years old when your mother and I met. You were carrying the weight of your family with the seriousness of someone 3 times your age, and you did it without complaint. You have become one of the finest people I know." He paused. "I am proud of you in a way that does not require biological claim to be real." Elias was quiet for a long moment. The town made its small sounds. A horse moved somewhere in the dark. "When I was 12, Elias said finally, "I thought I needed to be the man of the family because there was no one else. And then you were there, and you did not try to replace what I was doing. You just added to it. You made the weight lighter without taking it from me." He looked at Harlan with the brown eyes that were his mother's. "I have been trying to find a way to tell you that for 11 years. Harlan held that. He let it be what it was without deflecting it. "Thank you," he said. They sat on the porch in the dark for another hour and talked about the law and the territory's future, and what they both thought justice required in the specific conditions of the time and place, and it was one of the finer conversations of Harlan Stone's life. The winter of 1893 brought several things. Elias and Catherine announced their engagement to general celebration. Nora, who had been accepted to a teacher's college in Albuquerque, the first such institution in the territory that admitted women without restriction, began preparations to leave in the spring. Thomas, who had grown into a young man with his mother's directness and a gift for practical mechanics that had no clear origin in either parent, had taken a position with the railroad repair operations out of the Redemption Creek Depot. The family was moving outward and forward, and the movements were good ones, the kind that came from having been given what children needed to become themselves. Harlan and Rose marked their 11th anniversary in December of 1893 at a dinner that Delphine insisted on providing, because Delphine, now in her early 70s and as formidable as ever, regarded their marriage as a personal investment and anniversary dinners as appropriate returns on that investment. Sitting across from Rose at Delphine's table, the familiar lamplight warm on her face, which had the lines now of a life fully inhabited, and was more beautiful to him than it had been the day she stepped off the stage, Harlan thought about the morning he had told her children what was true. He had not known then what he knew now, which was that the measure of a person in the history of those who depended on them was not found in the dramatic gestures, but in the sustained ordinary faithfulness. Rose Sawyer had kept every promise she made, not because it was easy or because the circumstances cooperated, but because she had decided that promises were not conditional things, and she had held to that decision under circumstances that had tested it thoroughly. He had said it to her children because it was true, and because they needed to know it. He had not known, saying it, what it would mean to him in the years that followed, how it would become a kind of standard he applied to himself, a question he asked regularly about his own daily faithfulness. Was he keeping his word? Was he present? Was he the person he had promised to be? He believed that he was. He believed it with the careful honesty of a man who checked his own positions against the evidence. "You are thinking about something," Rose said, reading him across the table with the ease of 11 years of attention. "I was thinking about the day I told the children you kept every promise you made," he said. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was deep and warm and entirely unguarded. "I remember that day," she said. "I have thought about it many times since. And I have tried to be worthy of what I said, to be the kind of person who could say that and mean it about himself." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hand was warm and strong and entirely familiar and entirely alive to him. "Harlan," she said, "you have kept every promise you ever made to me. And I have never seen that before either." He turned his hand and held hers, and the lamplight was warm around them, and outside December moved through the New Mexico territory with the cold authority of a season that knew its purpose. And inside Delphine's there was warmth and the smell of good food, and two people who had found in each other the specific thing they had not quite known they were looking for. Delphine appeared with a bottle of something she said had come from New Orleans and that she had been saving for an occasion that deserved it, and she poured 3 glasses and sat down with them without being invited because she was Delphine, and she raised her glass. "To keeping promises," she said. "To keeping promises," they agreed. They drank, and the night was good, and the year was nearly done, and what lay ahead was more of this, more of the daily faithful business of being who they had chosen to be, which was everything. The spring of 1894 brought Nora's departure for Albuquerque, and the arrival of Elia's and Catherine's first child, a boy they named Miguel after Catherine's grandfather. And the double motion of someone leaving and someone arriving had a quality to it that Rose said was like breathing, the life of a family expanding and contracting with the rhythm of its own growth. Harlan stood at the depot when Nora left, the girl who had asked him with 9-year-old precision whether he intended to commit to her mother properly, now 19, and carrying herself with the contained certainty of someone who knows what she is going toward. She embraced each of her siblings with different calibrations of the same love. She embraced Rose for a long time and said something into her mother's ear that Harlan did not hear. She embraced Harlan last and said clearly, "I have always been glad you are who you are." He held her and said, "So have I," and meant both things at once. The stage took her, and the family watched it go, and then turned back toward the town and their lives in it. And Harlan walked with Rose's hand in his and James on one side, talking about something that had happened at school, and Clara on the other side walking with the particular stride she had developed that was going to take her somewhere, and Daniel riding on Harlan's shoulders, because at 3 years old the world looked better from that elevation. And he thought that this was the shape of his life, and that he would not trade a single element of it. In the years that followed, the family continued to develop itself in the ways that families do when they have been given a good foundation. Nora completed her education and returned to Redemption Creek to teach, eventually taking over the school where her mother had first come to the town, and the continuity of this was something Rose found deeply moving in a way she expressed only once, privately, to Harlan, sitting on the porch on a summer evening watching the light on the rocks. Thomas married a young woman named Adelaide who worked in the telegraph office, and who had the capacity to match Thomas's directness point for point, and the combination of the two of them was something the family found both entertaining and reassuring. James, who had inherited his birth father's name and his stepfather's eyes, grew into a man who worked cattle and later bought a small ranch east of town, and in his steadiness and his reliability, Harlan saw the qualities that the boy had absorbed simply by being present in the same house for years. Clara, who had never abandoned her early commitment to having opinions and sharing them, went to Albuquerque, and then to a law office as a clerk, and then, by a series of steps that required both determination and the support of people who believed she was capable, toward the legal profession herself, following Elia's path a decade later with the added complexity that women in law in 1900 New Mexico territory were still a novelty that required constant justification. She wrote Harlan a letter when she passed her bar examination that contained 2 sentences. "I had good examples. Thank you for being one of them." He kept that letter in his desk drawer. Daniel grew up in a household that had already established all its rhythms and traditions, and meaning by the time his memory was continuous. The youngest of a large family in a town where everyone knew the name Stone Sawyer with the warmth of long association. And he grew into a good-natured and curious young man who eventually, to everyone's surprise including his own, became a schoolteacher like his mother and his sister. Finding in the classroom the same satisfaction that Rose had always carried home from her days. Harlan was 52 years old in 1900. He had been the marshal of Redemption Creek for 21 years, and the town had grown to 4,000 people, and had been arguing about incorporation as a proper city for the last 3 years. New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, which eventually came in 1912, and the territory was different in most ways from what it had been when Harlan arrived in 1879 and took the badge. He had conversations with the new territorial administration about what came next, about whether, and when he would pass the position to someone younger, about what he wanted the remaining years of his active professional life to look like. These were conversations he had honestly, without the ego investment that might have made them difficult, because the badge was never the thing itself. It was the instrument for a set of values, and the values did not require the badge. Rose was 52 as well, in the autumn of 1900. She had retired from full-time teaching 5 years earlier when Nora's return made her succession both natural and sufficient. Though she remained involved with the school in an advisory capacity that everyone understood meant, she was still effectively setting the curriculum's intellectual direction, while allowing the formal responsibilities to shift. She was, in 1900, the most respected woman in Redemption Creek by a margin that was the product of 18 years of consistent, visible, documented good character. She sat on the school board and the town council, and a committee that had been established to address land grant disputes, and in all of these capacities, she brought the same quality she had brought to everything: the willingness to say the true thing with full acknowledgement of its consequences. They marked their 18th anniversary in December of 1900, with the whole family present, which was now an arrangement of sufficient complexity to require significant advance coordination. Elias and Catherine, Miguel now 6 and a sister named Rosa following, and their own life established firmly in Santa Fe, where Elias had built a respected legal practice. Thomas and Adelaide with their 2 children. Nora, unmarried and entirely comfortable with it, with an independence and fullness of life that needed no other structure. James with his ranch and his steadiness. Clara, visiting from Albuquerque with the energy of a person who was becoming what they were meant to be. And Daniel, 20 years old and freshly committed to teaching, sitting at the table with the expression of someone who knows they are at the center of something valuable. Delphine, who was 80 now and had reduced the scale of her operation but maintained its quality with iron conviction, sent dinner over rather than hosting it, and the meal was eaten in the expanded cottage that was properly a house now, around a table that needed to be extended with a second table placed end to end, and the noise of it was continuous and generative and full. After, when the younger members of the family had dispersed to various sleeping arrangements and the children of the children were settled, Harlan and Rose sat by the fire in the quiet of the main room with the sounds of a sleeping house around them. 18 years, Rose said. 18 years, he agreed. She looked into the fire for a moment. Do you remember the morning of the hearing, when Curtis had come and we did not know what would happen? I remember everything about that period, he said. I was more frightened than I let myself know. She said it without drama, simple honesty, looking back from a distance of safety. I had told myself I was managing it, and I was, functionally. But underneath that there was a level of fear about what might happen to the children that was very close to something I could not have looked at directly and continued functioning. He took her hand. "I know, I saw it. You did. You were very composed. But I had been paying very close attention to you for months by that point." He paused. "I saw the cost of the composure." She turned her head to look at him. "And you said nothing. You did not need me to name it. You needed me to do what I was doing, which was making sure it did not happen. Naming it would have used time we needed for other things." She looked at him with those brown eyes that held 18 years of accumulated knowledge of him, that had read him since the first morning on the steps of his office when she had said, simply, "You look as though you have been through something." "You are a remarkable man, Harlan Stone," she said. "I have had remarkable examples," he said, and meant it, and she knew he meant it. "What do you want?" she asked. "From whatever comes next." He thought about this seriously. "More of this," he said. "More of the mornings and the conversations and the table full of people. I want to see Clara established in the law and Daniel in the school, and I want to watch Miguel and Rosa grow up knowing what their father became. I want to sit on this porch with you when we are very old and be able to say that we used the time well." She leaned against him, and the fire made its small sounds, and outside the December night was cold and clear and full of stars. "Then let us do that," she said. And they did. The years that followed were good years, deepened by the accumulation of everything that had come before them. Harlan handed the marshal's badge to his deputy, a young man named Ford who had been watching and learning for 4 years, and who received it with the appropriate gravity in 1902. He did not disappear from the work of the community, because the work of a community is not the exclusive province of those holding official positions, and his involvement in the legal and civic structures of Redemption Creek continued in various forms until he was, as he had wanted, genuinely old and sitting on the porch. The porch was an excellent place to be. Rose lived to be 78, and she taught things until she was 70, and she kept every promise she made until the end, which was the end of a particular kind of person whose scarcity makes them memorable and whose presence, when you are fortunate enough to receive it, makes everything more possible. Harlan outlived her by 4 years, which he did not welcome but understood as the arithmetic of 2 lives that had been joined, and that would, eventually, conclude in the order that nature decided. He spent those 4 years in the company of his children and his grandchildren and the community he had given himself to. And he told stories about Rose with the specificity of someone who knows that the accurate details are what keep a person real. And he sat on the porch in the New Mexico evenings where the light on the red rocks was still doing something extravagant, and he was grateful. When Elias visited in the last year of Harlan's life, in the spring of 1906, they sat on the porch in the way they had always eventually sat on porches together, with the comfortable silence of long-established trust. "Do you remember," Elias said, "when I came to your office to ask about competing rights, the moral question? I remember. I think about that conversation constantly in my practice, in how I approach cases where 2 legitimate claims are in conflict." He looked at the rocks. "You taught me something I use every day." "Your mother taught you more," Harlan said. "Yes," Elias said. "She did." A pause. "She taught us all something I have spent my whole life trying to pass on." "What was that?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "That your word is not something you give conditionally. That the people who depend on you deserve the real version of you, not the managed version. That presence is not the same as proximity." He turned to look at Harlan with his mother's eyes. "I have tried to raise Miguel and Rosa the way she raised us. I do not know if I have managed it." "You have," Harlan said, and said it with the authority of a man who had observed it carefully. "How do you know?" "Because Miguel asked me last year how to decide what is right when 2 right things are against each other," Harlan said, and the ghost of a smile was in his voice. "And he asked it with your seriousness. And then he listened the way you listened." Elias looked at him, and there was something in the older man's eyes that was complete. Not the completion of an ending, but the completion of a circle, of something that had started at a porch in 1882 and had moved forward through all the years and all the things and had arrived here, at this porch, in the spring light, with the red rocks holding the valley they had all chosen to live inside. She was extraordinary, Elias said. She was, Harlan agreed. She kept every promise she ever made. He looked at the rocks. I have never seen that before. I saw it in her and then in you and then in all of you. She made that real for all of you. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and you, Harlan thought about this. I tried, he said. Every day I tried. You succeeded, Elias said, with the quiet authority of an eldest son who has been paying attention for 24 years and knows what reliable evidence looks like. The spring light moved on the red rocks and the town went about its business, and the porch held two men who had been shaped by the same woman and had tried, in different ways and across different occupations, to honor what she had been by becoming versions of it themselves. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the final accounting, everything.